A judge insults Clint Eastwood in open court. Minutes later, he's in handcuffs. Clint Eastwood wasn't new to pressure. He had spent decades dealing with criminals, corruption, and the kind of people who thought they were untouchable. But today was different. As he stepped into the courtroom of Judge Howard Gates, a man known for his arrogance and questionable rulings, Clint knew exactly what was coming. This wasn't just another trial. This was about a high-stakes government ethics scandal that could bring down powerful people. The defendant, a wealthy developer with deep political ties, accused of funneling state funds into his private empire. The evidence was airtight, and Clint had spent weeks preparing. But what he hadn't prepared for was the hostility coming straight from the judge's bench. Before Clint even spoke, Judge Gates barely lifted his head. Instead, he flipped through a file at an agonizingly slow pace, letting the silence in the courtroom stretch. A power move, a test. Finally, without looking up, he muttered, "Mr. Eastwood, I assume you've got something worth my time today? Or should we just skip ahead to the part where you embarrass yourself?" A few quiet chuckles rippled through the defense team. Clint ignored them. He'd seen worse. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to make sure the facts are laid out." Gates leaned back in his chair, barely hiding a smirk. Taxpayer dollars? Right, because that's never been the foundation of a pointless witch hunt before. Clint's jaw tightened. He had seen plenty of men like Gates before, slick, untouchable, and convinced they could get away with anything. But he wasn't about to let a corrupt judge control the room. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I wouldn't call felony corruption charges pointless." For a brief second, their eyes locked. Gates's were cold and calculating. Clint's, steady as a rock. But before he could continue, Gates cut him off again. "Mr. Eastwood, spare me the lectures. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to listen to whatever self-righteous monologue you've prepared." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judges could be strict, but this was personal. Clint took a slow, measured breath. He knew what Gates was trying to do. Throw him off balance, make him second-guess himself. It wasn't going to work. He picked up a folder from the table and flipped it open. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate..." "Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, Eastwood? Or is this just your way of compensating for something?" The shift in the room was instant. The defense attorney smirked. A few reporters exchanged glances. Gates had overplayed his hand. But Clint, he didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle men like this was to let them dig their own graves. He paused, just long enough to make it clear he wasn't rattled. Then he calmly set the folder down, folded his hands, and stared directly at the judge. "If you'd rather keep making this personal, Your Honor, I'd be happy to request a recess while we discuss your conduct. Or we can skip to the part where you start answering some real questions." The room fell silent, and just like that, the balance of power shifted. Clint Eastwood's warning, and the judge's big mistake. It was subtle, not aggressive, not disrespectful, but it was a warning, a clear message. He wasn't going to back down. Judge Gates's lips curled slightly. Amusement, annoyance, hard to tell, but he wasn't finished. Not yet. "Oh, I don't have concerns, Mr. Eastwood. I just know a weak case when I see one." This time, the reaction wasn't just murmurs. A few gasps, someone whispered under their breath. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to act. Clint felt the shift in the room. Eyes darting between him and Gates like a slow-moving tennis match. The judge wanted a reaction, a raised voice, a loss of control. That was the game. Clint wasn't going to play. Instead, he adjusted his stance, straightened a few papers, and met Gates's stare head-on. "Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking." But as he spoke, he saw it, just for a second. Something flickered in the judge's expression. Not just arrogance, not just condescension, something deeper. A man with a stake in the outcome. That's when Clint knew. This wasn't just courtroom theatrics. Gates had something to hide. What the judge didn't know. So did Clint. He'd been in plenty of tense standoffs before. He knew when a man was just trying to win a fight, and when a man was fighting for survival. Gates wasn't just ruling from the bench. He was playing a game, a calculated, deliberate effort to undermine Clint in front of the entire courtroom. The question was, why? Gates watched his every move. Every word Clint spoke, the judge was ready to pounce, waiting, testing. The slow tap of his fingers against the bench, the slight curl of his lips, like he was daring Clint to keep going. Fine, he'd keep going. Your Honor, Clint said, voice calm, controlled. These documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly triple the approved amount, none of which appears in state records. He gestured toward the projection screen where the financial statements were displayed. Now, if you look here, Mr. Eastwood, Gates cut in, his voice dripping with smugness. I hate to interrupt your little presentation. Really, I do, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day. Clint glanced at him, then back at the screen. Gates wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundations of the case. The judge scoffed. And yet, I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this. There it was again. Wasting time. Gates was trying to bury this case before it even got off the ground. A soft rustle behind Clint, the prosecution team shifting, exchanging uneasy glances. They felt it too. Something wasn't right. Clint tightened his grip on his pen, flipped to the next page in his file, and spoke clearly. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to denied. Silence. Clint looked up, and that's when he knew. This wasn't just about corruption. It was about power, and Gates was about to lose his grip on it. Clint Eastwood's move, the judge's last mistake. I haven't even stated the motion yet. Clint's voice was steady, controlled, dangerous. And yet, I can already tell you it's going nowhere. Judge Gates leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench. Let's be honest, Mr. Eastwood. This entire case is built on speculation. A little creative accounting, and suddenly you're crying corruption? The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a Navy suit, smirked. He hadn't said a word. He didn't have to. Gates was doing all the work for him, and Clint exhaled slowly. Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before hearing its contents? A pause, a beat too long. I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer. The shift in the room was almost tangible. Heads turned, eyes darted. Even the reporters in the back were writing faster. Clint caught the glance of one of the jurors, a woman in her 50s, wearing a dark blazer, her brows furrowed, lips pressed into a tight line. She wasn't the only one noticing. The problem with arrogance? It makes people pay attention. Clint squared his shoulders. Very well, Your Honor. Then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence. He turned back to the screen, clicking to the next slide. This document, obtained through a subpoena, shows that Mr. Eastwood, the tone was different this time. A shift. Clint stopped, looked at him. Judge Gates wasn't leaning back anymore. His smug expression was gone. Hands clasped, mouth a thin, hard line. Something had changed. Approach the bench. It wasn't a request. Clint hesitated for half a second, then set his papers down and walked toward him. The courtroom hushed. When he reached the bench, the judge lowered his voice, just enough for Clint to hear. I'd strongly suggest you reconsider the direction you are taking here, Mr. Eastwood. Clint tilted his head slightly. Excuse me? Gates didn't blink. I'm saying some fights aren't worth having. Clint let that sit in the air between them. Then slowly, deliberately, he leaned in an inch closer. I don't scare easy, Judge Gates. A muscle in the judge's jaw twitched. Clint turned and walked back to his table. That moment told him everything he needed to know. That wasn't a warning, that was a threat. But why? He had walked into this courtroom expecting pushback, maybe even hostility. But this was different. Judge Gates wasn't just biased. He was protecting something. Or someone. Clint adjusted a stack of papers, keeping his expression neutral. The prosecution team beside him shifted, waiting for him to react. He didn't. Not yet. Instead, he lifted his chin and faced the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence. Gates didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger, as if deciding how far he wanted to push. Finally, proceed, but keep it brief. Clint didn't acknowledge the jab. He simply reached for the next file. This document is a contract signed between the defendant and the city's planning board, outlining the proposed project expenses. You'll notice the total cost listed is just over $2 million. He paused. Then, with deliberate precision, he placed another sheet on the projector. However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's company, showing that the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount. Then, with calm finality, he placed a third document down. And here, he hesitated, just long enough to let the weight of the moment land. Is the approval signature signed off by Stay? Another beat. Judge Howard Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, it cracked. A ripple of movement, eyes darting, pens scratching. The defense attorney stiffened, his smug expression gone. And Judge Gates, for the first time since Clint had stepped into this courtroom, he didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't lean back. His face was unreadable. Clint let the silence drag out just long enough. Then finally, he turned to him. Your Honor, a slow, measured breath. Would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant? A calculated risk, but the judge had already lost the game. Clint Eastwood's last move, the judge's fall. He didn't have the full story yet, but what he did have, it was enough to shake the foundation beneath Gates. The judge finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat, his fingers pressed together, knuckles whitening. That document, he said slowly, is inadmissible. Clint tilted his head. How so? It was obtained improperly. He let that sink in. Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office. Gates's nostrils flared. Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court. This time, the shift wasn't just in the gallery, it was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff. Everyone was watching. Clint crossed his arms, his voice calm. You do realize this is a public hearing, correct? That the media is here, that every single person in this room just watched you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without reason? A muscle in Gates's jaw jumped. That's enough, Mr. Eastwood. Clint didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly he sat down. And that's when he did something that changed everything. He reached into his case and pulled out a small recorder, placed it on the table, and pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom. Low, gruff, unmistakable. Take care of it. I don't care how. The recording crackled, then continued. Make sure he doesn't get his hands on those ledgers. Silence. Absolute. Suffocating. Judge Gates didn't move, didn't breathe. Clint didn't look at him. He didn't need to, because now every single person in this room had heard him, and the real game was about to begin. The recording ended. No murmurs, no whispers, no speculation, just a stunned, collective realization. Judge Howard Gates had just been caught. Clint didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the recorder, as if daring Gates to challenge what had just played. But he didn't. He couldn't. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney finally blinked, his composure slipping. The smirk, gone, replaced by something closer to dread. He glanced at his client, the wealthy developer whose empire had been built on backroom deals and political favors. The man looked pale. Judge Gates cleared his throat. Mr. Eastwood, I don't know where you obtained that recording, but Clint cut him off, his voice unwavering. That's not the question you should be asking, Your Honor. A pause. The real question is, who were you talking to? Gates's fingers curled into fists. This is outrageous, he snapped. This entire hearing is descending into chaos because of your grandstanding. Clint leaned back in his chair, calm, cold, controlled. Chaos? His tone was light, almost amused. Clint Eastwood's final move, justice served. I'd say this is clarity. Finally, we have some transparency in this courtroom. The tension tightened another notch. Clint let the moment breathe, let Gates sweat. Then without a word, he reached for another document and slid it across the table. Your Honor, this is a transcript of a wiretap legally obtained during our investigation. He tapped the top of the page. It corroborates everything you just heard on that recording. Judge Gates stared at the document, but he didn't touch it. His chest rose and fell. Breathing heavier now, Clint turned slightly, glancing toward the bailiff. Officer Reynolds, would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud? The bailiff hesitated, then slowly he picked up the transcript. His voice was steady, but the weight of the words made the room feel smaller. We'll take care of him. Eastwood doesn't have anything solid yet, but if he does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom. A sharp inhale came from someone in the gallery. Clint folded his hands together. I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor. Judge Gates's eyes flickered toward the exit. A tiny movement, but enough. Enough for the room to realize. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about control, he was thinking about escape. But it was far too late for that. Motion denied, he barked. Clint raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? This hearing is over, Gates continued, his voice a fraction too loud. I will not allow Judge Gates, Clint said smoothly, dangerously calm. I wasn't asking for your permission. And then, he did it. The move he'd been waiting for. He turned toward the back of the courtroom, gave the smallest, subtlest nod. A door opened. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor. Then, Judge Howard Gates, a firm, authoritative voice announced, "You are under arrest." Gasps erupted. Reporters fumbled for their phones. Cameras clicked. The jury gaped. Even the defendant, the powerful man who had expected this trial to be nothing more than a formality, looked stunned. Judge Gates didn't turn, didn't move. He just sat there, eyes fixed on a single spot on his bench, as if he could make it all disappear if he just didn't move. But reality had already caught up with him. Clint remained seated as two uniformed officers flanked the judge. One reached into his pocket. The other pulled out a set of cuffs. This is absurd, Gates muttered, but the fight was already gone from his voice. The officer didn't blink. You have the right to remain silent. And for the first time in his career, Judge Howard Gates actually was. The sound of metal clicking shut was deafening. The cuffs locked around his wrists, sealing his fate in front of the very people he had spent years ruling over. The once commanding figure behind the bench now sat frozen, his expression a mask of disbelief. The courtroom erupted into stunned murmurs. Disbelief crackled through the air like electricity. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their hands moving furiously across their notepads. Even the jury, bound by duty to remain impartial, couldn't hide their shock. Clint stayed seated, expression unreadable. This wasn't about gloating. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Judge Gates finally found his voice. You can't do this, he whispered, as if he himself didn't believe it. The officer holding his arm didn't flinch. Sir, you are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You'll have your chance to speak with an attorney. Gates yanked against the cuffs, his face flushed. This is a disgrace. Clint Eastwood leaned back, and for the first time that day, he let the smallest smirk play across his face. No, Judge. This is justice, Juan. Clint Eastwood's last words. The fall of the judge and the real fight ahead. On the law in this courtroom, Judge Gates' voice thundered, but it rang hollow. Clint finally stood, straightening his jacket. Not anymore. Gates' head snapped toward him. For the first time, the arrogance was gone, replaced by something else, something closer to fear. The officers pulled him to his feet, but he resisted. This is political. Clint shook his head. This is accountability. The room went dead silent. A lifetime of unchecked power gone in an instant. Gates's face twisted. His jaw clenched as he turned toward the gallery. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for an ally. Someone, anyone, someone who would stand up and declare this a mistake. But no one moved, because it wasn't a mistake. A few feet away, the defense attorney had gone ghost white, and the developer, the man who had thought his influence could shield him, wasn't faring much better. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, his breathing shallow. Clint let his eyes linger on him for just a second. Then he turned back to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm, measured. "If you have anything to say, I'd suggest you save it for your arraignment." Gates's mouth opened, then shut, because there was nothing left to say. The officers began escorting him toward the side exit. But then, wait! The developer's chair scraped against the floor as he shot up, eyes darting between Gates and Eastwood. "This is getting out of hand. We can work something out." Clint turned, raised an eyebrow. "Work something out?" The man swallowed, visibly unraveling. I mean, there's no need for this kind of public spectacle. Let's be reasonable." Clint studied him for a moment. Then he took a step forward. "You seem nervous, Lawson." The man's mouth opened. No words came out. Clint tilted his head. "Why would that be?" Lawson shook his head, forced a weak laugh. "Nervous? No, this is insane. You don't seriously believe Gates is guilty, do you?" Clint let the question hang in the air. Then, "Do you?" Silence. The officers moved again, leading Gates through the door. The moment it shut behind him, the weight of it all settled over the room like a thick fog. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was the unraveling of a system that had been protected for far too long. And Clint? He wasn't done yet. He glanced back at the jury, at the judge's empty seat, and then at the defense table. "I believe we still have a trial to finish." But after what had just happened, everyone in that room knew this was only the beginning. The courtroom felt different now. Lighter, as if the weight of years of corruption had been lifted in an instant. Judge Gates was gone, hauled out in cuffs, and the shock of it still lingered in the air, like the final note of a symphony. Clint took his seat again, adjusted the papers in front of him. The trial wasn't over. Not yet, but the biggest obstacle had just been removed. He turned his attention back to the defense table. The developer, Charles Lawson, had gone eerily quiet. The usual smugness, gone, replaced by something colder, more calculating. He was still trying to assess the damage, trying to figure out just how much of his safety net had been ripped away. But Clint? He could see the wheels turning in Lawson's head. Without Gates on the bench, his legal team would have to argue the case on its own merits, and they had none. Clint leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Lawson," Clint Eastwood's final question, the beginning of the end. "Would you like to continue with today's proceedings?" Clint's voice was steady, unshaken. "Or would you prefer to discuss a plea?" Across the table, Charles Lawson's jaw clenched. "This is a witch hunt." Clint gave a small smile. "No, Mr. Lawson, this is justice," Lawson scoffed, shaking his head. "You think one corrupt judge changes anything? You think this means you win?" Clint didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment settle. Then finally, "I think it means the system still works," he said. "That no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth always catches up to them." Lawson exhaled sharply, but he had nothing left to say. The judge's seat remained empty, but it didn't matter. This case was no longer in his hands. The prosecution team exchanged glances. One of Clint's colleagues leaned in. "This might be a good time to push for a deal." Clint considered it. He could feel the shift in the room, the way the jury was watching, waiting. They had just witnessed something they'd never forget. But Clint wasn't about to let this end with a whisper. He stood. "Your Honor," and he paused, then corrected himself. "To the presiding judge who will take over this case, I'd like to submit a formal request to proceed with additional evidence. Given today's events, it's clear we need a full investigation into how far this corruption reaches." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Clint continued. "Judge Gates was only part of the problem. If my team could uncover this, it means there's more. More names, more people who thought they were untouchable." Then he turned to Lawson, met his eyes. "So I'll ask you again, do you want to talk?" Lawson sat rigid, fingers tapping against the table, weighing his options. Then finally he exhaled. "If I do, I want protection." Clint nodded slowly. "Then you'd better start talking." The courtroom wasn't the same place it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had shifted. The walls that protected the powerful had started to crack, and Clint Eastwood had just sent a message to everyone watching. No one is above the law. As the bailiff called for order and the trial prepared to move forward, the reporters in the back of the room rushed to get their stories out. This wasn't just another case, this was history, and it was only the beginning.